Hello, I'm Mrs H. You can find my patterns at www.mrs-h.com. So today's tutorial, we're going to be sewing the Happy Handbag. And this pattern is exclusive to Bag of the Month just for the January to March 2023 season. So if you want to sew this pattern between January and March 2023, now is your time to do it. Okay, so this is a fabulous beginner pattern. It's a classic handbag shape and we've got this gorgeous barrel end to the pattern. The overlays go all the way to the bottom. We've got feet and a nice solid base. And then these handles are two-tone handles. So you've got a different colour on either side. And I'll talk you through how to do this. But you can make that, you can make it the same colour if you like. You can make it two different colours. You can make it two completely different colours. There's no visible seams. There's no visible turnovers or anything in that. So all the raw edges are contained in those. The pattern calls for O-rings, but you can change those to rectangle rings if you prefer. And then inside the pattern, inside the bag, you've got a little flash of the exterior fabric inside. You've got two magnetic snaps which pull in and give your bag this beautiful shape on the end there. As I said, you've got a nice solid base. And because I'm going to talk you through everything in this video, you don't need to be worried or intimidated and think that this bag is harder than you think, because it does look very intimidating and very hard to make, but actually it's really dead simple, really easy. So it doesn't take a lot of materials. You can probably make this from most of your stash if you've got a little stash. I might have a little stash looking at what's behind me. But if you want to know how to sew this, then carry on watching and I'm going to talk you through every single step of the way. I hope you do sew with me. So get your supplies ready and we'll get started. Right, let's get started with our stabiliser then. So the only stabiliser we're going to put on at the moment is onto our end panels. And you should have cut your stabiliser 1 7/8 of an inch or 4.7 centimetres shorter than your end panels. Okay, so if you haven't, just trim that down now, that's okay. Now, unusually for stabiliser, I've cut mine exactly the right size. Usually I leave it slightly bigger and then baste and then trim it, but I've left it slightly I've cut it exactly the right size so that I can make sure I've got it lined up perfectly where it needs to go. So I'm still smoothing it on the back there. I'm just clipping it to hold it in place while I baste it. Oh dear, that's not very well smoothed on the front, is it? Top tip, smooth it on the front. That would be an idea, wouldn't it? Okay. So this is literally just to hold it in place while we baste it. We're going to baste at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. That's 6mm. Because our seam allowance on this pattern is 3/8 of an inch. So we're going to baste at 1/4 of an inch. So that it's in the seam, but not very far in the seam. Right, just make sure that I've got that lined up nicely. Yeah, I've learnt my lesson, see. Clipping from this side instead. Yeah. So once we've basted it, we can go and trim the excess out of the seam allowance then afterwards. If you've got a particularly strong machine, you might not want to. It's just to reduce the bulk, but I think that the seam sits a little bit nicer as well if you do trim it. Okay, so I'm going to increase my stitch length up to number 6, which is the biggest stitch length I've got on this machine. And then I'm going to start at this point where the stabiliser is at the top. Okay, so stabiliser doesn't meet the whole meet the top of the panel, so I'm starting where the stabiliser starts. I'm going to start with my needle down. I'm just going to whiz around here at 1/4 of an inch or 6mm seam allowance. I'll do the same for the other panel as well. Right, that is all the stabilising we're doing at the moment, just our 2 end panels. So you can put that to one side. We're going to add the stabiliser for the main panel later on, after we've sewn the main panel together. So that's all we need to do for the minute. We can pop these to one side and get on with our lining next. Okay, so next you will need a zip pocket piece, or your 1 zip pocket piece, and also a lining main panel. Now, as I say in the pattern, it would be really helpful to mark your centres, and I never do. I'm going to mark these now before we go any further. And I'm just marking the top and the bottom in the seam allowance. I'm going to do it on both sides so that I can see what I'm doing, and then I'll mark the centre of my zip pocket as well. Just using a pencil on the back here. Right, so with your zip pocket right side down and your lining main panel right side up, we're going to place the zip pocket on top of the lining main panel. Now I've actually got directional fabric, so I'm going to turn mine upside down. If you've got directional fabric, do the same as well. So make sure that your print is upside down, because then when you finish the zip pocket and turn it all through, the print inside, the bit that you see, will be the right way round. Okay, so my lining, that's the top of my lining, and then that's the top of my zip pocket because it's upside down. Right, so line up the centres here, and we're going to place this 2 inches from the bottom. That is 5 centimetres. So we'll just line that up. Okay, now we can add a couple of pins in here. I've got my little pin pot. I'm just adding them into the side, just to keep this in place while we're working with it. Okay, we're going to draw a box on our zip pocket piece, and we're going to place it 4 3/4 inches from the bottom. Hang on, I haven't got the metric for that, and I can't find a tape measure. I'll pop the metric in the pattern, okay? Make a note of that. So if you're using metric, it will be there for you. Okay, so we're going to draw a line, so 4 3/4 inches from the bottom of the box, bottom of the zip pocket panel. I'm actually going to draw mine all the way along. And then I'm also going to mark where the centre is, because I'm just using a pencil and it's not going to be noticed. And we are going to make it 7 inches long. It's 18 centimetres long and 3/8 of an inch high. So I'm going to measure up 3/8 of an inch, and that is the top of our box. And then we want it to be 7 inches long. So I'll put my 3.5 inch mark on that centre mark that I made. Just make that 7 inches long. Oh, I've made an error here by putting the pins in too early. I can't see where my, can't leave my ruler down. Right, do it that way instead. Okay, so I've drawn a box there that is 7 inches long, 3/8 of an inch high, and it is 4 3/4 inches from the bottom. And we're going to draw a line in the centre of this box lengthwise, so along the centre there. and also add a little triangle into each end. And this outside box is where we're going to sew, and then the triangles at each end and the center line is where we're going to snip. Okay, so make sure your machine stitch length is back down to regular stitch length, and we're going to sew directly on the box. I'm going to start here in the top corner, well, in a bit from the top corner, and I'm going to back stitch, sew along all the way round and get back and back stitch again, or just stitch over by a couple of stitches. When you get to this corner, stop with your needle down. If you need to change your stitch length down to a really tiny stitch in order to be really accurate here, then don't be afraid to do that. So stop at this corner with the needle down, lift up the presser foot and pivot, and then keep sewing to the other corner. Stop with the needle down, lift up the presser foot and pivot, put your presser foot back down again, and do that all the way round. Okay, but make sure that you're really accurate on these corners. So if you need to reduce your stitch length down to be accurate, then do. Okay, right, I am going to start in this top corner-ish. So I'm starting with my needle down. Right, I'm not quite in the corner, so I've reduced my stitch length down to 1 and taken a tiny stitch. Okay, and then I can lift my presser foot and pivot. And because I'm only going to the other corner, I might not bother changing my stitch length back up again. Right, so I'm at the other corner. Now I can pivot again. I am going to change my stitch length back up again, because this is a long line to sew on tiny stitches. Right, not quite at the corner, so change my stitch length back down again. Do a couple of tiny stitches, pivot and turn. Okay, pivot again. Oh, change my stitch length back up. That's a tiny stitch to be sewing on. Okay. Right, so we got all around our outside box. So we can take the pins out then. I'll get my pressing mat, which is just behind me in the cupboard. Oh, I should have opened both doors. Thank goodness you're on that camera view, you can't see that. Okay, so now we're going to steam press these stitches. And this is the key to a really neat zip pocket. Okay, so give them a little steam press now. And then what we're going to do, we're going to pull this down away from the lining and press against the zip pocket panel, and then we're going to pull this up away from the lining and press against the zip pocket panel, and then each side as well. And this is a bit extra long-winded, but this is the key to a neat zip pocket. Now if you're a more experienced bag maker and you want to change this zip pocket out for a different style of zip pocket, then please do go ahead. Don't be constrained by the pattern at all. Right, okay, so we are going to cut down that centre line now. So I'm going to use my little craft knife just to get this started down the centre, on that centre line, and then my small scissors, and I'm going to snip all the way along the line as far as the point of the triangle, and then into each point of the triangle, and I'm snipping as close as I can to those stitches without actually cutting through the stitches. Okay, so if you do this and then you turn your pocket through and find that actually it's not very neat in the corners, then you can go in and just take another tiny, tiny, tiny nibble with your scissors into the corner, just to get as close as you can. Okay. Right, let me check how that looks from this side. That looks fine. Right, so what we're going to do now is push this through the hole that we just cut. So push your zip pocket through to the wrong side. Now the temptation is to press it on the side of the zip pocket. Resist that temptation, and what we're going to do first is press it from this lining side. Now a zip pocket like this, you will get puckers. That's just a fact of bag making. However, if you press from this lining side, from the right side here, your puckers will be inside the pocket. Okay, so you can't control getting puckers or not. You can control where those puckers end up. And if they're on the inside, nobody's going to see them. And if they do see them, they shouldn't be looking in your pockets anyway. Okay, so I've pressed along the bottom there. I'm just going to finger roll the top of this box. Make sure that that's nice and neat. And then I'll give that a little steam press as well. And I'm going over the ends here as well, just to make sure that that is really nice and neat. Okay, so I haven't got any puckers showing at all on this lining panel. My box looks really nice and neat, but on the other side, on the lining side, there is a pucker here and here in the corners. Okay, so that's why if you press from the lining side, any puckers will be hidden inside your pocket. So I'd recommend doing that on any pattern that you do. Okay, so now on the wrong side, so we've got the right side of the zip pocket and the wrong side of our lining fabric here. We're going to need our zip. So grab hold of your zip, and before I do this, I always just give it a little double check, make sure it's nice and smooth. Great. My zip is actually really long for this zip pocket, but it was the right colour for me, so I thought I'd use it anyway and snip it down to size. Right, so get yourself some double-sided tape. Take the end off if it's gone dry, don't worry too much about it. And then we're just going to add a line along the top and bottom of our box. You don't really need to do it on the ends, just the top and bottom will be fine. Okay. Right, so remember this is upside down, the my zip pocket. So this is the right way to you. So this is the bottom of my panel here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to tape this zip into place. Add your tape on the zip pocket because it means that your tape won't be showing if you don't get your zip lined up perfectly. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move my zip pull into the middle a little bit more because my zip is so much longer. I'll take the backing tape, paper off my tape. And then we'll add our zip into place. What I like to do is I like to turn the panel over, so have the zip laying right sides up on the table, and then pop this over the top, and I like to line up the metal stopper on my zip because then I know exactly where that metal stopper is and it's showing through my gap, so that when I come to stitch this into place, I know that I'm not going to hit that metal stopper. If your zip is too long like me, you might want to trim that off. But personally, I like to have it showing so that I know where it is. Okay, so once you're happy with the positioning through that box, just turn it over and give it a little smooth down. Make sure it's all nice and attached there. Now, I would recommend sewing this right away. So don't tape it and then leave it, go for a cup of tea, come back, because your tape is only a temporary hold. So what we're going to do is, I'm using my walking foot, which is quite narrow. If you'd prefer, you can change to your zip foot. And I'm going to start down here. I'll turn this so this is the right way to use. So that's the bottom of my panel. I'm going to start here at the bottom, and then I'm going to sew around my box. Or rather, I'm going to sew around my box, whichever way it is. But by starting down here in the bottom, but not quite in the corner, that's really unnoticeable. So if you need to backstitch or you go over a couple of stitches to secure it, it won't be noticeable at all. The other option is to leave your thread tails really long and pull them through to the back and tie them, but I'm going to backstitch. So I'm going to start there, and I'm using my regular stitch length again. I'm just using my walking foot, I'm not swapping my feet, but if you would like to, you can. So I'm going to start around about there-ish. And I'm starting with my needle down. And when we get to the corner, again, I'm going to change my stitch length down if I need to. I'm going to leave my needle down and pivot and go all the way around the box that way. So go as slow as you like around here, and I'm sewing approximately 1/8 of an inch or 3mm away from the edge of that box. Now I'm not quite in the corner there, so I'm going to change my stitch length right down, do a little stitch and then pivot. Okay. Now, as I approach my zip pull, I can stop my needle down, lift my presser foot, and just wiggle that zip pull out of the way, and then keep sewing. I'm not quite there yet, so I'll take another tiny stitch. Okay, and then I can go back up to my regular stitch length. Now, as I'm approaching the end, again, I can lift my presser foot and wiggle that zip pull past the presser foot, and then lower my presser foot and keep sewing again. Right, there we go. Lovely. Now trim any loose threads that you've got. And then we're going to turn over onto the wrong side, and firstly, actually, I'm going to trim my zip down. Get rid of those extra bits out of the seam allowance. If you think your zip is going to see some heavy use, then I'd recommend fray checking those ends or adding a dab of glue or something. My bag is likely just to be for display for my studio, so I'm going to leave those open. Open my zip pull to the middle-ish, and then we know that that's definitely done. Do that now, okay? Now we're going to bring the top of the zip pocket down to meet the bottom and just pin it into place. Now there are 2 turning gaps on this bag. Okay, there's going to be a turning gap in the bottom of the zip pocket and a turning gap in the bottom of the main panel lining. While I'm doing this, so you're just pinning the pocket piece layers together. Okay, so don't pin the main panel layers together. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn the bag through using the turning gap in the main lining panel pieces, and then we're going to close that big turning gap by using the turning gap in the zip pocket, and then we can use the we can just use a machine stitch to close the zip pocket, because nobody will notice it inside your zip pocket. As I said before, if they do, then they shouldn't be looking in your pockets. So what we're going to do here, we're going to start here at the top, and we're only sewing through these zip pocket pieces. So pull your lining panel back out of the way. So we're going to start here at the top, back stitch here, and then sew to around about there-ish and back stitch. Okay, then I'm going to change my stitch length up to my maximum stitch length. For me, that's number 6, and I'm going to sew across this turning gap using my number 6 basting stitch. Then I'm going to decrease my stitch length back down to its regular stitch and back stitch here-ish. So between these 2 points, I'll have basting stitches, and then between these 4 points, I'll have regular stitch length stitching. So, and then we'll have back stitching at the top and the bottom, at top either side, sorry, and back stitching here as well. Okay, and then I'll show you what we're doing after that. So for now, we'll back stitch, sew to here, back stitch, increase our stitch length and baste, go back to our regular stitch length and back stitch, and then back stitch to there as well. Okay, so I'll do that now. So I'm using my regular stitch length to start. Remember to pull that lining panel out of the way. Okay, and I've back stitched there. Now I'm increasing to my basting stitch. And I'm changing down to my regular stitch length again. A bit of back stitching. Pivot, and we'll sew up to the top. And back stitching at the top there. Okay. Right, we can move these, take these pins out of the way now then. And grab yourself your pressing mat or your ironing board, and we're just gonna press along this bottom seam, the basting stitches here. Use a little bit of steam. I think my iron's on slightly too hot there. Okay, then what we're going to do is just leave it a second to cool down. Fold these seam allowances back and give that a little press. And then fold the second seam allowance back as well. Try not to scald your fingers when you're doing this. Just leave it a few seconds longer than me, maybe. Okay. Right, so they are nice and neat, folded back and pressed. You can leave those basting stitches in, or you can remove them now if you want. You can leave them in though if you want, but make sure that you leave this zip at least halfway open. Okay, now this panel can be put to one side for the minute, and we're going to need our slip pocket pieces. Okay, now we're going to fold these in half. I'll do them both together because we've got two. So fold them in half, right sides together, and they should be square. It doesn't matter which way you fold them, unless you've got directional fabric like me, in which case make sure that you fold them so that your design is horizontal. And we are going to sew around the entirety of this, leaving a turning gap in the bottom, same as we did the zip pocket. So back stitch here at the top, and again here, and then baste across the turning gap. I'm going to add a couple of pins in for the turning gap because otherwise I'll forget to leave it. And we'll do the second one same as we did before. Doesn't really matter if you've got directional fabric and you do it sideways, it will just be a design feature, but if you particularly want it to be facing the right way, then just make sure that you're doing it horizontally. Okay, add a couple of pins in for my turning gap. And then, right, I'm starting on my regular stitch length. Okay, so this is exactly the same as we did before. Increase to my basting stitch. And then decrease back to my regular stitch length. And I'll do the same for the other pocket. Right, okay, so let's take the pins out of those. Take the pins out, both of them. And then we're going to clip the corners. Now, to get really neat corners, what I like to do is I like to cut across like you usually would. But then I also like to snip into the seam a little bit extra at an angle, and the same on this top corner. Make sure you don't go through your stitches. Okay, so you can see I've taken a little bit extra off of this. So take your corner off, and then also a little bit extra into each seam allowance. Right, and I'll do the same on this one. It wasn't my best idea to use white thread on white fabric, I must say. It's a bit hard to see my stitches, but I don't think I've cut through any of them. We'll soon find out when we turn these through, won't we? Okay, so we'll just clip into that one as well. You're just reducing the bulk in the corners so you can get some nice sharp points then when you turn these right sides out. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is steam press those turning gaps. That line of basting stitches along the bottom. And then I'm going to fold my seam allowances like we did for the zip pocket. And actually, as this is still warm, they're folding back really nice and neat without even having any steam applied to them. Okay, I'll do the second one. Just folding these back. And this will give us a really nice, neat finish on our pocket. Okay, now we need a stitch unpicker or seam ripper. And we're going to take these basting stitches out in that turning gap. And as you're taking these out, you should notice it's leaving behind a nice, neat little line of stitch holes, dots behind. Make sure I've got that out of the way. Take these extra threads out. Okay, so you've got your nice, neat line of stitch holes, and you've got your seam allowance already turned under. So as you turn this out, you should be able to get a nice neat finish. on this. Oh, let me get my point turner. So just very, very gently run that along the side seams. Turn these corners out. And then we give it a nice press as well to make sure it's nice and neat. I just like to run this along the side seams and make sure that that's fully turned out. I find that it gives a really nice, neat finish then. Okay. Now, if you've used directional fabric, you'll notice that one side is the right way up with your turning gap at the bottom, and the other is, well, either your turning gap at the top or the print upside down. So just make sure to keep an eye on which side is right side up with the turning gap at the bottom, and then that's the side we'll top stitch on so that it's neatest on the front, and we'll attach it to our panels with everything facing the right way. Okay, so take these basting stitches out of this second pocket. Turn this through. We will give this a press as well before we add them to the lining, and top stitch the top of the pockets as well. Something I like to forget when I'm doing videos for some reason is top stitching the top of the pockets. Not sure how I managed to forget that, but there we go. At least I'm consistent in my errors. Right, so I poke the corners out, and these give a nice little push all along the seam. Turn this corner out just really, really gently so that if there is any weakness in that corner, you're not pushing through the seam. Okay, so my turning gap at the bottom, this is the right side up for me. If you're not using directional fabric, then just ignore this. If you are using directional fabric, then just pay attention to which side is right side up. Okay, just give that a nice little press. Make sure that turning gap is still folded under nice and neat, and it all looks completely straight along the bottom. Haven't got any odd bulges anywhere. Okay. And then we're just going to top stitch along the top here. I'm using my regular stitch length. You can change it up to a slightly larger top stitch length if you want, but you do need to remember to turn it back down again when you're doing construction then. So I'm sewing at 1/8 of an inch away from the top, or 3 mil. And I'll just do that for the second one. Just make sure my turning gap is at the bottom there, yeah. Okay. Right, so now we can pop these onto our lining panels. So again, if you've got directional fabric, just make sure it's facing the right way up. So here's my lining panel that I did before with the pocket on, and I'm just going to pin this zip pocket up out of the way so that it's not going to bother us. Let me check the placement for this one in my pattern so I don't tell you the wrong place. Okay. Line up the center. So this one should be placed 1.5 inches from the bottom of the panel. That is, let me think what that is. That is 3.8 centimeters. And I've lined up the center of the lining main panel on my ruler, so I can also center the zip pocket there as well. And then just pin that into place until we get to stitch it in. Just want to make sure that this is nice and parallel. So as we stitch this onto our lining panel, that will close that turning gap, so don't worry. So I'm going to start here at the top of the pocket and do a little back stitch. In fact, I'm going to do back stitch a few times because I'm quite rough on my bags. And then sew to this bottom corner, stop with my needle down and pivot, sew along the bottom, stop with my needle down, lift my presser foot and pivot, and back up to the top there as well. Okay. And I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch or 3 mil away from the edge of the pocket. Okay, now you've got the option of dividing this pocket however you wish. On this bag, I'm going to leave this one full size, and then I might divide the second one. So this lining panel is done. Oh, got my zip pocket there. That lining panel is done, and you can put that to one side and get your second lining main panel, and we'll add our second slip pocket onto this. So let's find the centers again. And I'm marking the center on the wrong side as well, just so when I come to my final construction, make sure everything is nicely lined up. And check my measurements again because I've forgotten in that few minutes. Right, so that's 1.5 inches. Line up the center so this is nicely centered. And pin it into place. We're going to stitch it on exactly the same, although I am going to divide this one. So I'll show you how I divide it in a nice easy way. So I'm just pinning this in place now. Now I'm going to divide mine up the centre because I think that is easiest. So all I'm going to do is line my ruler up between my 2 centre marks, because remember I've marked the top and bottom in the centre. And then I'm going to use my bone folder / point turner, and I'm going to score a line along there in the center. If you've got a fabric that you can use a chalk pen or something on, then that is also really, really helpful to do. I'm also going to add a pin part way along, just in case I get part way through sewing it and suddenly think, oh help, I can't see my line. Right, so let me turn this around. So that's the bottom of my panel facing you. I'm going to start sewing, where am I going to start sewing? Here. And I'm going to back stitch a bit and then go down to here, pivot, stop my needle down and lift my presser foot, pivot. I'm going to sew to this center line, stop my needle down, pivot, lift my presser foot and pivot. So up this line to the top, back stitch a couple of times. So back down that center line, along the bottom, stop in the corner, my needle down, lift my presser foot, pivot, and sew up to the top here. So I'll have back stitching in all 3 places at the top. I'll have a double line of stitching in the middle just to add a little bit of extra reinforcement, and this whole pocket will be stitched on in one go. So I'm just going to use my regular stitch length again and sewing 1/8 of an inch or 3 mil from the edge. So I need to just take a tiny stitch to get back onto the original stitching line so I'm in the right place. Right, so that should have 2 compartments now, all nicely reinforced there. Okay. All that's left to finish these main panels now is to add the base. So this is the bottom of my panel here. I'm going to add the base onto these bottom edges and I'm pinning these right sides together. So in theory you've cut if you've got directional fabric, in theory you've cut it horizontally and it shouldn't matter which way you have this. Okay, so now we're going to sew this. Actually, let's do our turning gap on this side. So now hang on, it does say in the pattern what size turning gap to leave. 7 inches. So let me measure that from my centre. If I do it on this panel, then in theory I shouldn't forget to leave a turning gap. Okay, so 3.5 inches. So my turning gap needs to be at least 7 inches. Do you know what? If you can leave a bigger turning gap than that, if you feel comfortable to, then please do. I might leave an extra inch. That might come back and bite me there. I'm going to try it. So what we're going to do when we sew this seam is we're going to back stitch at the start using our regular stitch length here. So back stitch at the start, sew to this first mark, back stitch there, increase to our long basting stitch, sew across that turning gap, go back down to our regular stitch length and baste across there where that second mark is, and then sew to, back stitch there where that mark is, and then sew to the end and back stitch again. So we'll have back stitching at the start and the end, and also either side of the turning gap. Do a good few back stitches there, just go over it a couple of times because you're going to turn the whole bag through this gap. You want that to be secure. And then between these 2 marks in the turning gap, we're going to use our long basting stitch. So I'm going to start off with my regular stitch length, and we're going to use our regular seam allowance as well of 3/8 or 1 centimetre. Okay, get back down to your regular stitch length. Okay, before I do the other side, I'm going to steam press these stitches so that I know that they are going to be nice and neat when we take these out. Now you don't need to turn the seam allowances back on this because remember we are going to close this through the gap in the zip pocket. Okay, so you don't need to worry too much about that. We are, however, going to open the seam and press these open just on the very edges, just on the ends there. And that'll make it easier to put our lining end panels in as well if you've got these opened out. Okay, so we've got one lining main panel with a pocket, we've got our base with the ends opened out, and now we're going to add our second lining main panel. So make sure that this is right sides up, and we're going to add the base onto the bottom of our lining main panel. I'm going to flip that over so that I can see a little bit better, because it's got the bulk of the zip pocket there. Okay. Now we don't need to leave a turning gap on this side. We can just sew the whole seam all in one go. No problem at all. We'll backstitch at the start and the end of this seam using our regular seam allowance, regular stitch length. Okay, and again we're going to press the seam allowances open on the ends of these panels here. With this one you can go along the entire seam if you want to, just help it sit nice and neat. When it's finally finished it will sit nice and neat then. Okay, so let's have a look through then. So we've got our lining main panel with zip pocket and slip pocket, base, and then lining main panel with slip pocket, and the tops of the slip pocket are here and here facing away from the base, so that when our bag is finally constructed you'll be able to put things in your pockets and they won't all fall out. Okay, next thing we're going to do is put the end panels into our lining main panels. Okay, so go ahead and get hold of your lining end panels, and that's what we're going to do next. Right, we're nearly done with our lining, so all we need is our lining end panels. I've got both of mine. And our lining panels, which we've done. So first thing we're going to do is mark the centres at the top and bottom on our lining end panels if we haven't already. This will just help you manage to put these in really nice and neat, and also help you line up later on. And then what we're going to do is get our lining panel, which we've already added our pockets to. So we've got our main panels either side and base in the middle. Fold this in half and you should be able to line up your seams perfectly together. And then we're going to mark the centre of the base there, and going to do the same on the other side. So line those up at the top. Your seams should match, and then we'll mark that in the centre. Okay, now you'll need one end panel. So with your lining main panel and bases, your lining, we'll just call this your lining panel, right sides up. Pop your lining end panel right side down, matching the centre to the centre of your lining panel. Okay, and then we're going to add a pin. I'm adding it in on the other side. So I'm going to sew with this end panel down on my machine, so that if there is a chance of any puckers I can control them, because I've got my flat panel on the bottom there. Then what we're going to do is actually I'm going to add a couple more in, because there's a little bit of flat on the bottom of the end panel, so I'll add a couple more in along here. Then what I'm going to do is fold this so that my top of my lining main panel matches the top of my lining end panel. Turn it around so that you can see it like that. And I'll add a pin in there, just hold it. Okay, so I've got my centre and my end. I'm going to do the same for the other end as well. So bring those up to match. Turn it around, it's a little bit easier for me to do it this side. Match the top and add a little pin, okay? So your lining end panel is only attached in the centre and the top at the moment. Now we're going to go around and just pin this into place. Make sure that those bottom seams are still open. Now on this, because there's a nice curve on the end panel, I'm pinning as far as the seams. So you've got your seam where your lining main panel meets your base. So I'm going to pin as far as there. Then I'm just going to snip into the seam allowance on the lining main panels. So just very, very small snips, about 1/8 of an inch, 3mm in. And that will help me ease it around these curves without getting any puckers. Just add a few snips and that should help you ease it into place. When you get to these straight bits, you can just flatten those out and pin them or clip them. So that you can ease this around the curve, you just need to add a few little snips in. I might need to add a few more in there, and that will just help give it a really, really nice and neat tight fit on this curve. So just ease it in. And then we'll do the same on the other side. I'm going to start with a straight edge. Keep going until I get to the curves. Just snipping into the seam allowance there. And you can just ease that in around the curve then. Without these snips, the panels won't match. But if they matched without the snips, then you would get puckers on either one of the panel. So that's why I do it so tightly fitting, so you don't get any puckers. Right, so that is pinned into place. I'm going to sew this. Now we're going to start sewing at the top using our regular 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then we're going to taper down to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So the majority of it were 1/2 inch, and then as we near the second side, taper back to a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance, so they match at the tops. That's going to need to match the exterior, but we're taking the extra bulk out of this seam. So we're going to use our regular stitch length. I'm going to start with my needle down. I'm starting at 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre, and then I'm tapering to a 1/2 inch, which is 1.2 centimetres. Okay, so we can take these pins out now. Now I recommend before you trim any seam allowances, just to have a little double check that you haven't got any puckers, because if you want to go back and unpick and redo a section, it's a lot easier to do that now before you trim any seam allowances. Right, that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to trim these using my pinking shears. If you haven't got pinking shears, then just cut a few notches in to the seam allowance around the curves, and that'll help it sit nice and neat in the final construction. Just going all the way around with my pinking shears, just nice and easy. Just takes the bulk out and helps it to smooth around curves. Okay, so just give that a double check. Yep, all good. Right, we're going to do exactly the same on the second lining end panel and the other end as well. So exactly the same. Feel free to fast forward me if you know what you're doing and you don't want to hang around for me, that's okay. So I'm pinning the bottom, pinning the straight bit as far as the seam, then I'm going to match the top. Pin these straight bits. If you prefer hand basting rather than pinning, you can absolutely hand baste these end panels in if you prefer. Right. Just do these straight bits and then go back and do the clip into the seam allowances. I'm just pinning my way round. This one looks like it fit beautifully. And I need to snip the other side. Even though I've measured the centres and it's all exactly centred, for some reason one side fits a bit neater than the other side. That's okay. We'll just add a few snips in. Seam allowance. Pin that into place, and then we can sew this the same as we did for the first one. Okay. So remember, we're starting at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then we're going to taper to 1/2 inch. So that's starting at 1 centimetre, tapering to 1.2 centimetres. Right, lovely. Okay, so now we're going to trim the seam allowance like we did before. And then that will be our lining done until final construction. Just trim these with my pinking shears all the way around this bottom curve. Make sure it's nice and neat. Right, okay, so that is our lining complete. If you want to go ahead and open up these turning gaps now, you can, or you can wait and leave them until after we've added them onto the exterior. It's up to you. But that's our lining complete, and it's time to move on to the exterior now. Right, that was a bit of a rookie error, so I've changed my thread colour over now. So I'm going to start at the end, and back stitch at the start and the end. I'm going to start with my needle down. We're using our regular stitch length, regular seam allowance. Okay, now if you can, then I would recommend pressing this seam open. If you can't, don't worry too much. Let me check the instructions, check I'm not telling you something wrong before we do this. No, I'm correct. Okay, what we're going to do is open these seam allowances. If you can't press it, then you might want to consider adding some tape just to hold it open. I'm going to try giving mine a little press and see how it goes. I've got a little cloth here that I can add over the top as well. So in an ideal world, you're going to press these seam allowances open. Add a little bit of steam there. That didn't work too bad. Didn't work too badly at all. Give that a little bit of a press here. We're going to top stitch to keep these seam allowances open anyway, so don't worry too much. If you need to use double-sided tape to keep these open, then please do. Okay, let's see how that looks from this side. It's nice and neat. Okay, not staying open too well, so I think I will add a bit of tape just to hold those open while we're stitching, and you can stitch through this tape, so that's okay. Now for my top stitching, I do like to increase my stitch length slightly, but if you do, then you need to remember to turn it back down again afterwards, okay? If you need to leave yourself a little note or something, or make it a habit to always check, then that's a good idea. Right, and just fold this back, press it onto the tape. There we go, that's much better. Okay, now with my tartan open as well, much neater. Right, so now we're going to top stitch either side of the seam. And we are going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch or 3 mil either side. And I've increased my stitch length just slightly. Turn it round and top stitch the other side of the seam as well. Now this is purely to keep these seam allowances open. If you're not confident that you can sew neatly either side of the seam, then just sew one side, maybe on the base, and then with the seam allowances open, just sew over the edge here in the seam allowance, just to keep those seam allowances open. Right, so let me get my second exterior panel, and I want to double check that my weaving is going in the right direction. Yep, okay. So now I'm going to add this first panel back on, so matching up the bottom of my second exterior panel with the base, and we're going to do exactly the same as we did on this first side. So we're going to sew at 3/8 of an inch. Now if you increased your stitch length, you might want to decrease it back down again before you sew this seam. So I'm wondering if maybe I should tape this side first before I press. Might make it a little bit easier to press my tartan that way. Let's give it a go. There's only one way to find out, isn't there? So I'll add my line of double-sided tape along here. And then open this seam allowance of my faux leather onto there. Tape is not hugely secure, but it's okay just for temporarily holding things like this. Okay, I'll add my cloth again. This is wanting to spring open this end. It's very bouncy, this faux leather. Okay, give that a little press. I'm using steam as well, and I think that helps in situations like this. Right, how's that? That's a bit better. I try clipping that end, see if that helps at all. Right, we'll do my top stitching now. So I think because the faux leather is so bouncy, I'm going to try and top stitch on the faux leather first. Put some of these things away. Right. Kosher, if you increase your stitch length on the first lot of top stitching, then change that back up again for this side, just so that they match nicely. I can feel that's slightly not open. There we go. And then we'll do the second side as well, if you're doing the second side. If you're not, then you can just stop there. There we go. Okay, so that's our exterior panel all sewn together. Now we can add our foam. So what you're going to want to do first is fold this in half and find the centre of the base. So match up your top edges, and in theory your seams should match, and then that will give you the centre of your base. Now I would recommend, if you can, putting it on the right side as well as the wrong side, because we're going to be adding foam onto this wrong side, so you won't see it. You can always remark it again, so don't panic too much. Just a little bit easier to mark it before you get the foam on. Okay, so I've marked both sides there. Right, now grab your foam, and we are going to fold this in half as well to find the centre of your foam. A little bit fluffy on my foam where the wool is coming apart slightly, or fraying slightly. It'll be fine once it's all attached to the stabiliser. Okay, so that's the centre of my stabiliser. So I'm going to match the centre of my stabiliser to the centre of my main panels. This is quite a long panel here for me to fit on the table, but I'll angle it slightly so that you can see the majority of it. So line this up so that your centre mark is matching the centre mark on your base. Add a clip, and then turn it around and match it the other side as well, and add a clip. Okay, then we can turn this over and smooth it out properly. Oh dear, a flying clip there. Okay, now you're going to want to smooth. Oh, hang on, I've forgotten to trim my foam down to the right size. Let me trim my foam down to the right size, I'll come back. Right, we'll try again now that I've actually cut it to the right size. I obviously missed that step. Okay, so I've remeasured to my centre, because obviously my centre has changed where I've trimmed it down. So match my centre, and then smooth your exterior fabric over your foam. Now the foam won't go all the way to the top, same as for the lining. So just make sure that your side edges match up nicely and there's no lumps or puckers. Okay. We'll just adding clips along the side here so it's nice and taut. All the way to the top of the foam. And then the same on the other side. I smooth this down. There we go. And smooth the second side down as well. Doing it this way just means that you get a nice smooth rounded finish around that rounded bottom of the end panel, rather than adding it to each individual piece, and then you've got the bulk of it in the seams and things as well. So this way you shouldn't have. Okay, now we are going to baste just along the side edges from the top of the foam to the bottom of the foam. Yeah, you see both bits there. You can backstitch at the start and the end if you want, doesn't matter. We're going to use our 1/4 of an inch seam allowance so that this is inside the seam allowances. And I'm going to use a long basting stitch. Okay, now this is quite long, so try and hold it as straight as you can while you're doing this basting so that it doesn't shift around or wiggle or anything. Oh no, I've lost it. It's fallen off the end of my table. Right, I'll have to pause you a second while I get it. Hang on. Well, what a disaster. Oh dear. Right. Let's base the second side on now that I've finally retrieved it. I'll have to try and remember not to let go of it at the end of this one. Okay, I've got hold of it. Okay, phew. Gosh, that was embarrassing, wasn't it? Right, okay. So obviously now the secret's out, my table ends around about there. Right, that looks great. Okay, so we can pop this to one side for the minute. I'm leaving my pins in the centre there because we're going to need to know that marking later. Actually, before we do, let's trim off this extra foam. So turn your panel over to the back and we're going to just trim the extra foam away from these seam allowances as best you can, if you're able to. Not much to hang on to here. All I've done is pulled my foam out at an angle and I'm holding my scissors as straight as I can here at a bit of a horizontal angle and trimming this extra away. Just to reduce the bulk in our seam allowances, and it will help it sit nice and flat then when we turn the bag through at the end. Right, and I'll do the other side. We can also do this with the end panels as well if you haven't already. You might have watched me earlier and thought, hang on, you forgot to trim the foam, and done it then, in which case give yourself a gold star for getting ahead of the video. Oh dear, trimming through my basting stitches here. Okay, right, nearly finished this one. And then I'll do my end panels and then they're ready for construction. We're going to move on to the handles and the overlays next. Okay, so pop your main panel out of the way. If you want to, you could just add a couple of pins along the top here to keep everything all together, all of your layers. If you're using faux leather, then you wouldn't be able to do that, but I'm using fabric. So I'm just going to add a few pins in the top to help keep that nicely smoothed out and in place while I'm working with it. We're going to add our handles and overlays onto this anyway, so that will secure it before our final construction. But just while you're working with it, if you want to hang on to it. Okay. Right, so pop those to one side and I'll get my end panels and just take the foam out of the seam allowances on these as well. Just while we're here, give us a nice neat finish at the end then. Don't worry too much if your foam is slightly wonky or there's not much in the seam allowance, just trim what you want out of there. There's one. I've got a stray thread there. It's attached to my basting stitches maybe. That can go out of the way as well. Just trim the second one. Not often that you add your stabiliser part way through construction. So it's nice, makes a nice change, doesn't it? Something a little bit different. They say a change is as good as a rest. Trim around here. There we go. Okay, Right, they could be put to one side and we're going to get started on our handles and overlays. So you'll need your handles, your overlays and your O-rings. Right, so I have got 2 overlays, which I'm going to put to one side for the minute. And I've also got 2 handles in my exterior fabric, my contrast. And I've also got 2 handles in my lining fabric, although I've swapped my lining fabric actually for this glittery charcoal, because I think that on my tartan the lining fabric would be a bit too busy. So I've got 2 and 2, so they're going to be in sets, 1 of each. So you can pop 2 to one side for the minute, and what we're going to do is we are going to sew, maybe I'll do them this way up actually instead. I'm going to sew the end, short end of one exterior to one lining, or one contrast if you're using it. Oh, I just need to plug my machine in. Hang on, I turned it off while I went and had some lunch. Okay. Right, so we're going to use our regular stitch length. So change your stitch length back down again if you had changed it before. And maybe I'll use a clip to make sure that I'm not going squiffy. And we're matching the short ends. And we are going to use, let me double check what seam allowance we're going to use. We are going to use the regular 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, because it doesn't say. Okay. So I'm going to stop my needle down. So regular seam allowance, regular stitch length, back stitching at the start and the end. Okay, I'll do the second one while we're here. And then do them both together. Just exactly the same. Right, okay. Now what we need to do is open out these seam allowances. We've already seen I'm not having much joy with pressing open these seam allowances yet. Might add a little dab of glue into there. My glue is a bit solid because it's gotten quite chilly in the studio. Add a little dab of glue. See if that helps. Pop it under there for a sec. And glue this side as well. Okay. Right, there's going to be a bit of gluing in this one with mine because I've got this faux leather which doesn't fold very well. Oh no, oh no! Trying to glue it open. Right, there we go. Okay, so they are just going to sit for a second and glue open. Now, what we need is 4 O-rings. I'm using these ones from Emmeline Bags. So you should have, well, we're going to put 2 on each handle. Very nice. I do like a bit of shiny bling. Okay. So what we need to do first, before we add our rings onto our handles, maybe I'll clip these and see if that helps them to set a little bit. I think my glue has just gotten too cold here in the studio and it's just not running very well. Right, what we're going to do is we're going to draw a line down the centre of these handles. So these handles are 2 inches wide, so I'm going to draw a line at 1 inch. I'm going to draw it the entire length. Because my fabric is dark, I can use a pencil and get away with it. Just drawing it all the way down the centre. And then again on the other side of the fabric as well, the other side of the seam. I'm going to do this for both of them. Well, I hope I don't lose that off the edge of the table again. That wouldn't be great, would it? I think I'd learnt from my mistake. Okay. Right, so I've drawn a line along the whole length of that. Pop that out of the way. And I'll do the same on this one as well. If you've got a longer ruler, it's much, much quicker to do this, but I've only got my little ruler up here in my filming room. Because my table is not very big. Doesn't seem to matter how big your space is. It will never be big enough. Okay. Right. So I'm just doing exactly the same on this handle as I did. First one, marking along the centre. So 1 inch away from the sides. Right, now what we're going to do, now that we've marked those, we're going to add our O-rings on. So grab 2 and pop them on. Actually, it doesn't matter which way you put them on, as long as they're on there. And then we are going to match, and make sure these are not twisted. So we're going to match this second end together and sew those the same as we did the first end. Okay, so I've got a nice loop with my rings on, not twisted at all, and I'm going to sew that using the same 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. That's 1 centimetre if you're metric. And then again, I'm going to open this seam allowance. So I'll do this and leave this to dry while I'm sewing the second one, in the hope that it does actually stay in place. So I'll just add a dab of glue, push that seam allowance open, and then try clipping it. See if that's helped. There we go. Lovely. Okay, so I've got my loop all nicely sewn, not twisted or muddled or anything. Got my 2 rings on there, so I can pop that to one side and get the second handle. I'm going to add our final 2 rings onto this one, and then make sure it's not twisted again, and sew through this. Okay, right, then I'll open this seam allowance as well. Just double check I haven't got that twisted. See if I can glue this open. Right, a dab of glue, push it open, and then add a couple of clips just to hold it. Okay. Right, so we'll go back to our first one again. Now, if you're using fabric, then you would have been able to have pressed this and folded it and kept it all really nice and neat. But I haven't, just to be awkward. So I'll show you how I do this. Now, I'm going to pop it under the foot, the presser foot. And then I'm just going to manually fold the edge into the centre as I'm sewing. And that actually works pretty well. So as long as I can get this first bit folded in nice and neat where the seam is, then it all seems to follow along. And we're going to sew on this wrong side. Well, I say wrong side. It's the right side of the fabric there, folded over, but this will be the right side of the handle in the end. So we're going to sew at 1/4 of an inch or 6 mil away from the edge, all the way around this whole loop. Okay, so pop that under your presser foot, make sure it's all nice and neat and lined up, and then start with your needle down. Now, if you increase your stitch length for top stitching, then you're going to want to do that now. Okay, and all I'm going to do is just fold this in to that centre line while I'm sewing. Okay, so I'll do it up here. I just wanted to show you down here so that you could see, because you can't see what's happening right at the top of the machine. So that's all I'm going to do, is just fold it in as I'm sewing, but I'm doing it up here at the presser foot. Okay. Now I haven't backstitched, I'm just going to do a few stitches overlapping when I get back round. So just take your time doing this. It's better to be nice and straight and accurate than to do it fast. Okay, taking those clips off just so that I can fold this in over the seam, and just move the rings out of the way as you sew in. Right, so as I'm approaching the end, just doing a couple of stitches over and then a couple of back stitches just to secure that. Okay, so now I've got one side nicely secured, folded over and secured. And trim my threads, and I need to do exactly the same for the other side. So all I'm going to do is put it in the machine the other way round, so that again I'm starting on my faux leather, because I think that that gives me a neater finish then. If I start on my faux leather, it maybe doesn't, but I like to think it does. So all I'm going to do is exactly the same again, and sew all the way round, folding these edges in to the centre, to that centre line, well, to meet that first edge really. If you want to fast forward me, please do. I understand fully that this is not the most exciting thing to be watching, but if you're following along, then do follow along. But if you are just watching to find out what to do, then feel free to fast forward me. I'm not going to give you any extra information than I've already given you, so that you won't miss anything. Right, that's lovely. So we've got our nice loop of a handle with our rings attached, and we've folded over the edges. Looks all nice and lovely. Now's the time to turn it into a handle. Okay, so what we're going to do is fold it so that those raw edges that you've got are on the inside, and flatten it out so that one ring is at either end. Now you should have both sides perfectly equal because they started the same size, so surely they should have stayed equal. That's a nice theory, isn't it? And all we're going to do is, if you make sure that the ring is directly at each end, so exactly the seam is exactly under the ring, and then pop a little clip on there, and then do the same the other end, so the seam is directly under the ring, and then with it flattened out nice and neat, make sure the layers are lined up perfectly. Add a couple more clips just to hold it in place. Add another one there. And then what we're going to do to turn this into our handle is we're going to sew at 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. So that's 3 mil away from the edge. But we are going to stop 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters away from the O-rings. So I'm going to mark that on my handle because I am absolutely terrible at guesstimating, and I always end up going too close, and it's a real pain in the bottom. So I'm gonna use some chalk just to mark where 3/4 of an inch away from the end of the handles is, and then I know that I can sew as far as there but no further. So what I'll do then is I'll sew all the way around up to that line, across that line, and down the other end. I'll mark the other end as well. Just want to be sure. I'm trying to stop setting myself up to fail, and I know that I'm terrible at guesstimating how far things are away from the end. So I'm just going to mark that just to be sure. So I'll probably start round about, oh, I don't know, round about there-ish, I think. And then sew all the way down as far as that line, along that line, back up, along that line, and back to where I started. Now, sew slowly. Make sure your stitch length is the same stitch length you used on these middle bits. Take your time. Don't panic, okay? This stitching is going to be amazing, and that will make our handle nice and neat. Okay, right, so I'm using my walking foot. You might find that your walking foot is a little bit wide for going as close to the end of the handle as 3/4 of an inch. So if you find that maybe your walking foot is a bit wider, then feel free to stop before then and add a rivet or something. No problem. Okay. So I'm sewing this at 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, or 3 mil. Right, so I've stopped on that line with my needle down, and lift my presser foot and pivot, and then sew along that line. Now I'm going to pivot and check I'm not quite far enough. So remember our trick from before, change your stitch length down. It won't really be noticeable if it's just 1 or 2 stitches that you do like that. Okay, and then change your stitch length back up again. Now I forgot to say, which hopefully you're watching this slightly in advance of making it, but if you're using a walking foot like this, you might need to just push that ring through for the first few stitches just to give it a bit of encouragement. Okay, so as we're coming through, just give that ring a bit of a push. Okay. Just make sure that that ring doesn't get stuck under your foot then. Okay, so that is one of our handles done and ready to use. The second one is constructed exactly the same. Okay, I'll do it on camera so that if you are following me then you can follow along, but I won't give you any extra information than I've already given you. If you would like to, you can add a rivet in the end of each handle there just to secure it onto the ring. Okay, can put that handle to one side and we'll get started on our second handle. Just folding those edges in and then we'll add these to our bag. Right, so there's both of our handles sewn and I can just give that chalk a little rub and it will come off. Don't forget to trim your thread tails. Okay, so that's both of our handles sewn. We're going to sew the overlays next and then we're going to get those added onto our bag. Okay, the next part of our handles, so we can pop these away, is to do the overlays. So pop those to one side for the minute. We don't need them right now, but we will need them again very soon. Right, so grab hold of your two overlays and same as we did for the handles, we're going to draw a line down the centre. So they're 2 inches wide, so our line is going to be 1 inch away from the edge. Now if you're using fabric, you can fold these into the centre and press them. If you're using faux leather, you can glue or use double-sided tape, or if you are a little bit on the impatient side like me, you can just fold them and stitch them as you go, like I did for the handles. Right, so I'm drawing a line down the centre and then we're going to fold each long edge into the centre and stitch it to secure. We're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch, 6mm. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this at the top to start with and just add a clip. And then I'm going to sew, and while it's under the foot, I'm just going to use my fingers to fold the long edge into the centre as I'm sewing. If you prefer to fold it and press it, if you're using fabric, then please do. Be a much neater finish. If you're using faux leather and you want to glue it or use double-sided tape, then please do as well. You don't need to fold it and hold it. Oh, that rhymes. Fold it and hold it. Don't need to do that while you're sewing if you don't feel comfortable doing that. Okay, so we're sewing at a 1/4 inch away from the edge using our top stitching stitch length, if you've changed your stitch length to be slightly higher. And I would recommend just a couple of back stitches at the start and the end just to stop it unravelling. clipping this at the end so that I know that it will be even all the way down. It's a little bit easier to hold on to then. Okay. So I've done one side. I'm going to go and do the second side exactly the same, and then I'll do the same on the other overlay as well, so that both long edges are folded into the centre. Right, so both of those long edges are folded into the centre and stitched into place. So on the right side, it looks nice and neat just with my stitching. So I'm going to do exactly the same on the second overlay. I haven't got any extra information or tips to give you, so I'm just going to sew this exactly the same as I did for the first one. Right, so we should have our two overlays. You can get your straps back now with the O-rings attached. And we're going to form one big loop with all four of these. So on the back of one of your overlays, I'm going to draw, well, on the back of mine, you'll need to do yours. So on the back, I'm going to draw a line 3 inches from the top. Because we are going to fold the end of the overlays through the rectangle rings by 1.5 inches. So if we draw a line that's double that on the back, then we'll know how far to fold it to. Okay, so we're going to attach one handle on to one end and fold it through by 1.5 inches. I'm going to add a dab of glue onto there and then clip it so that it's got a chance to just set before we carry on. So fold the end of your overlay to meet that line that you've drawn at 3 inches, and that will give you 1.5 inch over. Just going to clip that into place, and then I'm going to add the second handle onto the other end of this overlay, and I'll straighten this all out in a minute as well. And let's put it through before I add the glue. Okay, so as you're gluing this through, you need to make sure that the wrong side of the overlay, so the side that's got the raw edges, is facing the same way as the lining side of the strap. Okay, so both of the right sides should be facing out. Well, I'm assuming here that you want your exterior fabric to be on the outside of the strap, or the handle. If you don't, then you can change that, no problem. Right, so I've got here one overlay with a handle attached to each end. See if I can fold it like this. You might be able to see it a bit better. Okay. So I've got the raw edges of my overlay showing and the lining side of my handles showing. So on the other side, I've got the nice finished side of my overlays and the nice exterior fabric of my strap or my handle showing as well. Okay, so without twisting anything, so making sure it's not twisted, we are now going to add the second overlay so that it will form a loop. So we've got the first overlay the first handle, no, that is the overlay, sorry. The first overlay attached here, and then we're going to attach a second overlay on to the bottom here and the other end of these handles. So you should have a nice big loop when we're finished. So I'm going to draw my line the same as I did before, 3 inches, because it's a real easy way to make sure that you're turning it over by exactly 1.5 inches. Just make sure that you're nice and even. Okay. Right, so now I'm going to fold this through the O-rings. Again, I'm adding a dab of glue. And then I'll clip just to hold that in place while it dries. And a couple of clips just to keep that in place. So I've brought my overlay, the raw edge of my overlay, to meet that line that we've made at 3 inches. So then I've got 1.5 inches folded over. Okay, so we'll do the second end of the overlay through the other handle. So we should have each overlay attached to both handles. Fold that through and clip it. Right, so at the moment it looks like this is our handle and this is our overlay. So I'll just change it slightly. Make sure, as I said, that it's not twisted and you're all facing the right way. So we've got our 2 overlays here with one handle attached at one end and the other handle attached at the other end. And we've got our raw edges of our overlays and the raw edges of those inside long edges there. They are all facing the lining side of my straps, so that's my shiny side for me. Now you can leave those clipped for a minute. What we're going to do is we're going to add this whole loop onto our exterior of our bag. So let me get hold of that where we left it before. Right, so do you remember this? We've got our main panels and our base. Now I've left my pins in to mark where the centres are. We're going to need to know that so that we can line these up exactly. I'm going to place these on top. We're going to match the centre of the overlays to the centre of the base, and we're going to put them with 6 inches between each overlay. So that'll be 2.5 inches from each long edge. So that's 15 centimetres between them and 6.5 centimetres from each long edge. So first thing we need to do is find our centres. So to do that, I'm folding it in half, just in case it's stretched or, you know, my measuring and gluing isn't quite accurate. So that's my centre there. And I add a little bit of chalk because we need to know that later as well. Okay, I'll measure the centre of this overlay. And you can tell the difference between your overlay and your straps because your overlay is just the one layer and it's got these raw edges on the back, whereas your straps are the 2 layers and nicely finished off. Right, so we're going to line these up. All the while you're working with these, make sure that they're not twisted. They do like to twist around a bit, so just make sure they're not twisted when you're coming to secure them. Right, that's fine. So we're going to line up our centres of the overlays with the centre of the base, and I'm going to measure 2.5 inches from the edge of my main fabric. In fact, let me line up the centre on my ruler as well, that'd be easier. Okay, so this is where this overlay needs to be. Now if you've got faux leather that doesn't mind pins, which mine doesn't actually, any pinholes do come out quite easily, they get disguised, then you can pin it. Alternatively, add some double-sided tape or some glue. We are going to stitch these into place, so this is just a temporary sort of holding, but we don't want them to shift around when we're sewing them later, so do secure them in how best you can. I'm going to use glue on mine because I do not want these shifting on my video. That wouldn't be very good, especially not with my beautiful tartan that I've got. Right, so I've added my glue onto there, so I'm just making sure that's nicely lined up with the centre and 2.5 inches from the edge. I'm just going to move my ruler along just to confirm that that is completely parallel all the way along up to the top. There, 'cause nothing worse than it going slightly wonky, because that's the kind of thing that nobody else will notice, but you will notice. Right, so that side is glued on. I'm just going to pop my ruler on and just press down slightly just to help that glue adhere. Okay. Now very, very, very carefully fold your handles in and turn this around so that you can do the other handle. Or sorry, the other overlay. Okay. So let's measure. Again, the same as we did before. 2.5 inches. I'm going to pop that there. And just double check the distance between the 2 handles is 6 inches. Yep, that's great. Absolutely spot on. Obviously measured that particularly well this time, which I'm very proud of, and I'm going to make a point of. Right, so I'll add some glue on the back of this one. all the way along. My glue is rather cold right now, so it's not spreading quite so well as it usually does. Hopefully it will still adhere quite well though. Right, so I've got a nice little bit of glue on there, so line up my ruler again with the centre and the edges, and then turn this right sides over. Make sure, just have a quick visual check that it's not twisted. Once you're happy, then you can stick that down so that you are 2.5 inches from the edge. Oh, hang on, I've gone slightly off there. There we go. Make sure it's nice and parallel. I find you've still got a couple of seconds to manoeuvre it before this glue sort of sets. Make sure it's parallel all the way along. Do the same on this side as well. And once you've glued this, or once I've glued this, I am going to leave this to sit and then come back to it later. So I'm going to pause the video while this sets, because we don't want to be sewing with glue that's not quite dried, because it's not going to hold anything in place. Right, so what I'm going to do now, I've made sure that my handle loop is not twisted. I've made sure that my measurement's correct. I've glued this. I'm going to leave this to set. Let's see if it says how long. No, it doesn't say. I think I'm going to leave this for a good half an hour, and then I'll come back and we'll sew these overlays into place. Okay, so if you want to pause me while you go and do that, or you wait for yours to set, then do. If you're pinning, or you're using a different kind of method of adhering these, then feel free to just skip ahead to the next bit. Right, so my glue has dried now. So we're going to stitch these on. We're going to stitch using a 1/8 of an inch or 3mm seam allowance. So we're going to stitch all the way up. Now I'm going to start in the base area, because that's going to be at the bottom of our bag. It's not going to be noticeable. So I'm going to sew up one side, along the top, down the other side, along the top, back to where I started. Do need to leave a gap at the top here, so I'm going to mark this the same as I did for the handle. So I'm going to do 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters from that O-ring. So I'm going to stop sewing there. Just going to add my clip back in, just one of them, to hold it in place. Let's mark all of them while we're here, so then they'll be even. So we stopped sewing the handles 3/4 of an inch away from the rings. So doing the same on the overlays will make it nice and matching. So be careful as you're handling this. So turn it very gently, make sure nothing catches and nothing sort of flies off, because although it's glued, it's only very gently secured. We don't want things to come unstuck before we get a chance to sew them. So just treat it very gently. Okay. And I'll do this last side as well. And then we know they're all nice and even. I'm just using my chalk for that. Right, so I'm going to start in the base area. I'm going to use my regular top stitching stitch length. And I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch or 3mm away from the edge of the overlay. Starting in the middle there where the base is. Take your time doing this. No need to rush it. Okay, so we're approaching the top now. So I'm going to stop on my line that I've got there, 3/4 of an inch. And then I'm lifting my presser foot. So I've left my needle down, lift my presser foot and pivot. And then lower my presser foot and keep sewing. And if you're not quite at the edge, remember you can always decrease your stitch length just to get you to where you need to be. Right, so very, very gently pop it under, there we go. Okay, so remember at this point you might need to give the O-ring just a little bit of gentle encouragement to help it come out from underneath the foot. Make sure I'm nice and flat under there, yeah. Okay, so manipulate this how you need to, but remember, do be gentle with it. So same as we did on the other side, very carefully. And then lift and pivot. It's quite long, isn't it? It's should have thought of that. Okay. So as you're pivoting, just make sure that your handle is out of the way of the foot. There we go, and then you'll be able to pivot without it going wonky. Okay, once we're back to where we started, and you can finish that and cut your thread. So you should have a really nice neat box sewn onto your overlay, holding that in place, and that is nice and secure now. So now we need to do the second one. I'll just trim my thread, make sure that's out of the way. Now, I've learnt from the last one, I'm going to clear my workspace a little bit, get all of these little bits and pieces out of the way, because this is a rather sizable panel. Okay, I think I'm going to start, I'll turn it this way, so I'm starting on the outside edge, and I'm going to start in the bottom area again, or in the base, sorry. Okay, all I'm going to do is exactly the same as we just did. Go, just trying to make sure that I'm pivoting nice and smooth, not pulling anything out of the way, and then we can keep going back down this second side. Right, so this bit has come unglued slightly. I thought it was being gentle, but obviously not. So I'm just going to try and hold it. I'm just trying to hold it really, really even. Luckily, I've got my checks on my tartan. So I'm able to line it up on there. Okay. And our last pivot. There we go, back down to where we started. Right, now those are all secure, we can breathe out a little. Phew! Everything's where it should be. Nothing's twisted and it's all secured into place. Great. Now we're going to punch some holes for some feet. And we'll need some bag base as well. Right, let me pause you for a minute and go and grab, oh hang on, let me check my project pouch. I might have it here. Let's see if we were organised. Yes, here we go. Got my bag base. Well, gold star for me. Okay. Right, so we'll need hole punch, bag base. We've got 4 feet on this bag. Got my feet here. We're not actually going to insert these until near the end of construction, so you can pop those to one side. Now we're going to add these, we're going to do them through the overlays. So you're going to centre them on the overlays. And we're going to put them 1 1/4 inch, 3 centimetres from the centre of the base. So we've got our centres marked. Right, I've got my pencil or I've got my chalk. I'm wondering if you'll be able to see this. If I describe what I'm doing, that might help. So if I line up my ruler 1 1/4 inches from that centre line in the middle of the overlay, so you know we've got our centre line there. So I line up 1 1/4 inches there. Now my strap overlay should be 1 inch wide. So in theory, the hole is going right in the centre of that at 1/2 inch. However, just double check before you make your mark that it does look centred over that overlay, because you want it to look centred. You know, if your stitching isn't quite even, then it's better for it to look centred than be centred. That's what I always tell my husband when he's putting up curtains. He's very good at measuring, but sometimes I want it to look straight. If you've ever put up curtains in a house that's, well, was built before the 1900s, then you'll know that putting up curtains is more important that they look straight than they are straight, because they're often, the walls and the ceilings are often not straight. Now, I'm not saying that my stitching is not straight, but it's better for it to look straight. Right, so I'm just marking 4 holes. So I've got my 2 there, and do it on this one as well. So 1 1/4 inches from the centre and in the centre of the overlay. Okay. Now, this is slightly too far in to use my squeezy hand press hole punchy thing. So I've got a leather punch and a hammer, and I've got my Mum's old kitchen board here. Thank you very much, Mum. I don't know if she realised when she gave it to me that it would have quite so many holes in. I think she was intending for me to use it in the kitchen, but unfortunately it's been well used and well loved in the sewing room. That's fine. Okay, so all we're going to do is just punch a hole through each of these 4 marks. And then we're going to use those later to add our feet. Right, now if you're using fabric, you will probably want to add a dab of fray check onto there. I'm using faux leather, but I'm still going to add a dab of fray check just in case, because the last thing we want is our holes growing and our feet falling out. Honestly, bag making is another language, isn't it? Okay, right, pop my board back down again because I'm finished with that. Now, if you want to add a label, the measurements are in the pattern for where to place it. You would just make sure that it's centered in between the 2 handles. And 6 inches or 15 centimeters from the bottom seam. I'm not going to add a label at the moment because I've run out of gunmetal ones, and I'm trying really hard not to buy extra hardware. It's not going too well, but right, okay, so we've made our holes in the base. Now get your plastic bag base. I believe I've already cut this down to size. Let's double check. Double check that I've got it right. Yep, that's perfect. Now the pattern does tell you where to punch your holes, but if you've got mesh like me, then I'll show you this other way that I use. Because I find that sometimes it's a little bit more helpful just to be able to adapt slightly. Okay, so let's mark the centre. You can mark the centre by snipping it. So I'm lining it up on the centre of my base and 1/2 inch from each edge, which will make it perfectly centered. Okay, so that should in theory be in the center of the bottom of your bag. Looks pretty good to me. So where you can see those holes that you've just punched, I like to just snip a few of these little plastic cross sections out, just to make a nice sized hole in my mesh, ready for when we put the feet in later. Okay, so I've just cut through those. Right, let me turn around. Every time I turn around, I'm flipping the handles in just to reduce the strain on them. You can add some rivets if you prefer. In use, it won't be sort of pulling on these, but last thing I'd want is to catch it on the corner of the table and rip my stitching out at this point. If you are comfortable with rivets, you can always add some rivets through the handles and the overlays. Right, just finish cutting extra hole there. Okay, oh, a bit extra. Cut in the wrong place. There we go. Okay, right, so I've got my holes in the right place now. So that I remember which side and which way this is supposed to go in, I've done this on the right side. So for it to match, it needs to go in like this in the final construction. Okay, so just double check that your holes all line up, and if they do, add a little scrap of tape if you've got some tape. So I'm going to add a piece on this end on the right side and on this end on the right side there. So when I come to put my base in, All I need to do is make sure that these are both right sides up and at the same end, and then my holes will match up perfectly. In theory, I like to say in theory, because just in case they're not at the end. Okay, right, so we've done our base, we've done our holes, we've done our feet, we've done our handles. We just need to cut some holes for our magnetic snaps now. And again, we're not going to insert them until later on. Right, I need something, a little bit of weight. So I'm going to put my hole punch set. We're not actually using the hole punch set. I just don't want this to go flying off the end of the table like it did before. Okay, I don't know if I need these pins in here anymore, holding it in place. Because we've added our overlays, haven't we? Right. Okay, so we're going to cut our slits for our magnetic snaps, and the centres of them are going to be 1 3/8 of an inch from the top edge, or 2.8 centimetres from the top edge, and 3.5 inches or 9 centimetres from the centre. So let me just double check that my centre is where I think it is, because I forgot to measure it on this one. Yeah, it is. Right, so it's perfectly in line with my blue and red stripe of my tartan. Okay, so you'll need 2 magnetic snaps, although you only really need the washers at this point. I'm using Emmeline Bags magnetic snaps, so you can ignore everything else. You just need the washers for now, because all we're going to do is mark and cut the holes for these, and then we're going to actually apply them later on after we've done the sewing. Right, so let's get my ruler and line myself up nice and neat. So we're going 3.5 inches from the centre and 1 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, and that is going to be to the centre of our washer. So pop the centre of your washer in that place there. Okay. Just trying to think what I've got that is going to mark these holes through here, and I'll be able to see them because tartan is pretty fancy. Hang on. Right, bear with me a second, I'll pause you and I'll come back. Right, I wasn't able to find anything that I think I'll be able to see very well, so I'm going to mark it and then try and remember where they are by using a pin. I'm going to pop a pin in just so that I can find these holes again at the end. Okay, so I'm trying to use a biro here, just a ballpoint pen, just to mark it. It's not going too well. Oh my goodness. All of you at home are probably thinking, why don't you just turn it over so you can see what's going on the interfacing side? My goodness. Well, top tip for those of you who are as slow as me at working that one out. I wonder if we can edit this and make it look like I knew that all along. Right, okay, so 3.5 inches from the centre and 1 1/8 of an inch, and draw your mark. That's where the centre of your washer is going to go. Then 3.5 inches the other side. Draw your mark. That's where the centre is going to go. Right, that's so much easier to see on this side, on the interfacing. What a silly sausage. Okay, so draw your prong marks, and we can snip. Well, you can snip through them or slice through them. I'm just going to use my no, I'm not. That's terribly blunt. I think I need a new knife. I use my tiny scissors and do this very, very carefully. And I will add fray check to these as well. Don't want these holes to grow during use. Okay. Right, that was so much easier, wasn't it? So top tip, turn it over. If your fabric is busy, turn it over and mark them on the wrong side, and then dab a fray check. And I'm also going to now add a pin on the right side so that I can find that again later when we come to add the snaps in to the finished bag. Okay, right, great, that's one side done. Turn it around and do the other side. Make sure my handle's under. Okay, trim a loose thread there, keep it nice and neat as we go. So my centre was the blue and red line that I double checked earlier. So we're going, let me double check that was my centre. Yes, it was. We're going 3.5 inches from the centre and 1 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Add a little mark, and the same the other side. And we'll use the same washer again just to mark it. Just mark those slits for the prongs to go through. There we go, much easier. Right, that washer can now go back in the packet. We don't need that until almost final construction. So I'll cut through these little prong slits. And I'll add a dab of fray check like I did before. Just want to be sure that these magnetic snaps are not going to go anywhere once we're installed. It's a lot easier to add fray check now than it is to fix a bag once they've frayed. Okay, right, and then I'll add a pin in the right side of these as well, just so that I can identify where they are. Oh, hang on, where have they gone? Gosh, those are very well disguised. Good job adding a pin now. Okay, right, there we go. So that is the exterior ready to put together. So if you are adding a label, you can do so. Oh, I was nearly taking the pin out then, wasn't I, for marking my snaps? Don't do that. Okay, and we're ready now to add the end panels in and construct our exterior. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is add our end panels. So if you can remember where you put these, retrieve those. They should have the foam on them already. Okay, so we've got our centres marked on our base. Go ahead and mark the centres on your end panels if you haven't already. And I'm actually going to mark the centre at the top as well, because that will help us with our putting our lining and exterior together as well. Make sure it's nice and even. Now, exactly the same as we did for the lining, except we're going to sew using our regular seam allowance. We're not going to increase the seam allowance here. So match your centres and then match along the straight bits. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pull this up to meet the top of the end panel. Clip that into place. And then we'll just ease this around the entire end panel. And if we need to clip into the seam allowance on the main panel, we can. should fit nice and snug. Okay, so I do need to clip into the seam allowance there on the main panel. So all I'm going to do is just make some little snips into the seam allowance, not too big, just enough to help this ease around the corner and still give a nice snug finish. Okay, just ease that into place and clip it in. And that should fit together pretty well. Now we're going to do the other side as well. If you want to hand baste this before you sew it into place, then feel free to. Alternatively, you can use a stapler within the seam allowance and staple it before you sew. It's up to you. I find that staples do scratch my machine, so just be aware of that if you are thinking about using staples. So before I get to clipping, I'm just going to make some snips in the seam allowance here, because I already know I'm going to need them because I needed them on the other side. It's a bit easier to snip while it's flat. Then I'm just going to bring these two ends to meet each other. And just add clips all the way around, just easing this into place. Okay, so where you've added your snips, that should just ease that around that wide curve. Nice and neat. Okay. So you can see that that's fitting nice and neat in there. So if you want to baste, pause me now and baste, and then we're going to sew this into place around the outside. Okay, we're going to use our regular 3/8 of an inch seam allowance or 1 centimetre seam allowance. Use our regular stitch length, and we're going to back stitch at the start and at the end, same as we did for the lining. Right, okay, so change my stitch length down to my regular stitch length, and then pop this under the presser foot. Now I like to sew with the end panel on the bottom because I find you can control the bag a little bit better. Then you can squash the main bit of the bag down out of the way. Just manipulate it however you need to make sure that the bit under the foot is nice and flat. Back stitch at the start and the end, and then we're going to sew all the way around. Right, so once you've sewn that, just have a check. You can pop your hand in or you can look visually and just double check there's no puckers in that seam between the main panel and the end panel. So I'm just double checking now. You can always poke a bit of the seam out just to double check. Don't worry if it doesn't sit quite right, as long as there's no puckers, because we're gonna trim this seam allowance now anyway, but we don't want to trim it until we're sure that there's no puckers or anything that needs altering or changing. Yeah, that looks fine to me. Okay, I'm going to take that pin out of the centre now. I think I've spiked myself on it multiple times now. Right, so we can trim this seam allowance down with our pinking shears, or if you haven't got pinking shears, you can just notch the seam allowance. Just trimming around the curves, just to help it sit nice and neat. Just takes the bulk out of here. Oh dear, I forgot how furry tartan is when you trim it. It's going to be a bit furry on my mat today. Okay, trim this side as well. Okay. Right, once you've trimmed that, you can poke it out if you want. Just double check that that's sitting nice and neat. See if you need to take any more off the seam allowance or any further notches. It looks okay to me. Just doing a quick turn through. Looks pretty good to me, so that's fine. I'm happy with that. If you're happy with that, then you can just pop that back in, ignore it. Now we're going to add our second end panel into the second side. So again, find your centres. I'm folding mine in half to find my centre, and I'm also finding centre at the top as well, which will help when we put this in with the lining. Okay, so I'm going to match the centre. I've just put this down flat on top of my base just to keep it in place, and matching my centres right sides together. Now this is exactly the same as we did for the first side, and I did need to snip into the seam allowance, didn't I? So let's do that while it's nice and flat. Tiny snips, they're hard to see on this tartan, but I can hear the scissors going through it, so I'm assuming that it's snipping them, and the other side went in perfectly, so it must be doing what it's supposed to be doing. Okay. Right, so as we did before, just clipping along the flat sections. You can add as many clips as you like here, nobody's going to know. Add as many as you feel that you need. Okay, and then we just bring in the top of the main panels over to the top of the end panel, and again clip as far as you can on the flat sections, and then we'll do the same on the other side at the top. And we'll go down the sides then, just clipping these into place, and that should ease around the curve on your end panel where you've snipped those notches in. That's looking pretty good to me. Just trying to make sure that I haven't got any puckers in there while I'm clipping, and then I know that I won't have any puckers in there when I come to sew it. Looks good to me. Okay. I'll just finish clipping this second side. Into place along the straight edges first, and then around the curves. Lovely. Okay, so then we're going to sew this into place exactly the same as we did for the last end panel we did, or the previous end panel. We're using the same seam allowance, same stitch length. Absolutely exactly the same. Okay, don't forget the back stitch at the start and the end. Okay, and don't be afraid to just squash your bag how you need to. Just manipulate it out of the way so you can get to where you need to. Oh, flying clip there. Right, now I have got one area I just want to go back and double check that I haven't got any puckers, because as I was sewing it I did wonder whether I would. No, I can't feel any puckers. I think that might have been a lucky escape there. Excellent. Okay, so I can't feel any puckers, so I'll do a quick visual check. Take my pin out that was in the centre. Now I've got lots and lots of extra pins in here, haven't I, that I added in earlier to keep all the layers in place. I can take those out before they get hold of me. I'm going to leave in the ones that are marking where my magnetic snaps are though. And then I just want to have a quick look before I trim this seam allowance. I just want to push the corners out and double check that there's no puckers around there before I trim that. No, there's a nice stray thread there. Where do they come from, these extra threads? Always appear after you've sewn a seam, don't they? So I'm just pulling these curved corners out to double check that there's no puckers. Yeah, great. Okay. Right, poke that back inside and I'll go round and trim my seam allowance on these curves. Take the bulk out of this seam here. That's what's going to give us our nice rounded shape on our finished bag. You can have the best end panel in the world, but if you've got too much bulk in your seam allowances, then it won't sit quite right. Now I've got lots and lots of extra fluff on my bag from trimming that tartan down. So I think I might have to just get a bit of tape on that, or a lint roller or something. See, I do have a lint roller actually. Just do my table first. Get all of those bits of fluff up, and then I'm just going to lint roll on the inside of my bag, even though I know it's going to be inside and underneath the lining, but I've got a really light coloured lining and I don't want these dark bits of extra fluff showing underneath my linings. I don't usually lint roller the inside of my bags, but on occasion it's really handy to be able to do. I don't want these dark threads showing underneath my lining. Well, the threads are not too bad, but it's the big chunks of thread that I don't want showing. Okay, there we go. There's a big dark thread there as well. Right, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better. And you might think I'm a bit funny for doing that in the first place, so I better stop there and leave it at that. Okay, right, we are so nearly finished, so close to the end. Next we're going to put our lining and exterior together. So go and retrieve your lining that we made earlier. Right, so we've got our lining and we've got our exterior ready to put together. So before we go any further, make sure that the zip pocket in your lining is open and your gap is open, and also the gap that you've got in your lining seam allowance as well. Okay, so you've got two ways of doing this. You can either turn your exterior right sides out and put it inside the lining. You'll get less creases turning through, but you'll have to really squash it. Or, this is slightly easier, turn your lining right side out and then pop that inside your exterior, which is wrong side out. Now, if you've got a label, you probably want that to be on the front. So make sure you match up whichever panel you want to be on the front with the front. Mine look pretty similar, so it doesn't really matter which way I pop it in. Okay, so put that inside. Now this is going to be much, much shorter than the exterior because part of the exterior is going to turn over to form part of the lining. Open up these seam allowances and just match each seam together. It's really important that you have these seam allowances open, because in your final construction you want those seam allowances to be open to give a really nice neat finish along the top where it folds over. I'm gonna have to fold this. Gosh, this is quite tall, I think, for me. Got an idea, I'll stand up. That would be easier, wouldn't it? Right, so all I'm doing is just matching each of these seams together. So the lining seam is matching the exterior seam, and I'm clipping those with the seam allowances open. And I've marked the centres of my end panel so I can match those together as well. And I match these other seams, and hopefully they should match all the way around the top then. Okay, so I'll just clip and turn. I'm only doing the seam allowances at the moment. And then the centres of the end panels, yeah, they match. And then turn your attention to the centre of your main panels and match those centres, and then clip the remainder. Okay, and don't panic that the foam doesn't go all the way to the top. That's how it's supposed to be. It will go all the way to the top once we've finished, because part of our exterior is going to end up in our lining. Right, okay, so once you've clipped all the way round and it all matches nice and neat, then we're going to sew around the entire top, and we're going to use our regular construction stitch length, whatever it is that you're using, and we're going to sew using our regular seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. Okay, the only thing to be aware of at this point is making sure that your seam allowances stay open when you get to each seam. Okay, so pop that under your presser foot. Actually, I'm going to add a pin because my lining is shifting around a bit there. I've got a bit of a gap between my clips, so I'll add a little pin just to make sure that those layers stay together as I'm popping it under the presser foot. Okay. Okay, so as I'm approaching this seam, just checking that the seam allowances are open. Just pulling this out of the way so that I can sew around the top. And as I'm approaching this second seam, again making sure that the seam allowances are open. before I sew over them. Okay, so we're just going all the way around the top. Just keep moving your bag out of the way however you need to. I'm coming up to the final seam allowances now, so making sure they're open still before I stitch over them. Just pull it out of the way, however you need to make sure that bit under the foot is flat. Okay. Right, so, I've got a stray pin in there, haven't I? Well remembered. Snip any extra threads that you've got, and then we're going to turn this through the hole in the lining seam, the main panel of the lining, because that's the larger hole. So just take it slow, just pull it through gently. No rush, no need to force it. Okay, right, I'll make sure that's all nice and neat. Lovely, all good. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to fold this top of this exterior over into the lining, but we need to make sure that our seam allowances are still open as we do that. So reach in and pinch each top there. You can make sure that the seam allowances are nice and open still, and then we're going to fold that down. Actually, before we do that, let's measure. So you should have 1.5 inches or 3.8 centimeters of exterior inside the lining by the time we get to the end of this. So let's just add a pin where 1.5 inches is, and then we can be sure that we're folding over by the right amount. It should, in theory, follow the line of the foam inside. So what you can do is push your lining inside and just use your fingers to smooth it up over the exterior and down into the lining. And you can clip that into place there. Now it's very handy actually that I've used tartan, because I can follow the line of the checks in this instance. So I'm just clipping that with 1.5 inches of exterior inside the lining. And if you want to be sure, you can just make sure, you can just pull your lining down inside and make sure that those bottom seams are right in where they should be. We're just folding it over the foam, so the foam will be along the top line in the end. And we'll have our bit of exterior inside the lining as a little feature. Now I can feel in this corner that my seam allowances are not open anymore. So I'm just going to reach in there, encourage those open, and then refold. You'll be able to feel, because it just feels really bulky in the corner, and that's going to affect your top stitching when you come to it. So just make sure that those seam allowances are open before you fold it over, if you're using something like faux leather. If you're using cotton or fabric, it doesn't matter so much. Okay, there we go. So I'm reaching through the lining there just to make sure that these seam allowances are open, and then folding it down and adding a clip. Okay, that looks pretty nice and neat to me for those three sides. So let's do this one again. So open the seam allowances and then fold it over. That's it. Lovely. Okay, right, I seem to have got a bit enthusiastic here. Looks like there's slightly too much in there. So just push down your lining inside and make sure that's fitting nicely. Okay, you don't want a saggy lining, so just double check that you haven't folded over too much, and it does look nice and neat. It does to me. And then we'll just measure inside and double check that what we've got showing is the right measurement. It's not too much. It's easier said than done laying down. I was trying to do it laying down so that you could see it, but it's not so easy. That's 1.5 inches, yeah. So I like to just measure along the centre of each panel. That needs to come down slightly. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty good. That needs to come down quite a bit there. Okay, just pull that down, and I seem to have lost one of my pins, keeping a marker of where my magnetic snap holes are. So I'm gonna just feeling where the fray check is on there. Can I add that back in again? Okay. Right, so that side just needed to come down a touch more for it to be even. That looks pretty good to me. Oh, I've lost another one. Another pin there. Wonder what I've done with those then. I've probably taken them out, haven't I, while I was taking other things out. Right, what we're going to do now, we're going to top stitch around the entire top of the bag. 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, or 3mm away from the edge. You can top stitch if you've got a free arm. You can take that off and just top stitch as usual. I've got a flatbed, and I want to be sure that I'm stitching on the outside of the bag. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn mine inside out, and then I'm going to sew inside the bag so that I'm sewing on the exterior fabric, but with my presser foot inside. I'm just being quite gentle here to make sure that I'm not disturbing any of my clips. Oh dear, I've gone a bit wonky there. There we go. Okay. So if you want to start in somewhere slightly inconspicuous, that's really good. Another stray thread. Where do they come from? Who knows? So I think I'm going to start on I think I'm going to start on an end panel actually, because once the bag is finished and snapped up, then that will be hidden inside the bag. So I'm changing, or I'm going to change to my top stitch length, starting with my needle down. We're sewing at 1/8 of an inch away from the top folded edge, or 3mm, and I'm starting sewing just where that end panel meets the main panel. Okay, so we're going to sew all the way around the top. Okay, so I'm just manoeuvring the rest of the bag out of the way as I sew. Okay, nearly at the end now. There we go. Okay, right. So that went pretty smooth. Hopefully it will look as good as I think it will once we turn it out. Another stray thread from who knows where. Right, so if you've sewn it inside like me, then turn your bag right sides out. I'm going to add our magnetic snaps now. I know it seems a little bit backwards to be adding magnetic snaps at this stage, but we want to be sure that they're not in the way of our top stitching. Okay. Oh, that looks pretty neat. I've lost the pin again. I'm probably going to go, I don't know, oh, there we go. One's fallen on the floor, that's okay. Phew, I thought I was going to go home and find all these pins stuck in my jumper. Right, next thing we are going to do is reach through. So we've got holes in the bottom of our lining and in the bottom of our zip pocket, don't forget. I'm going to reach through and add our magnetic snaps. So wherever you put your magnetic snaps for safekeeping, retrieve them now. And you'll need some scraps of foam and some duct tape as well to secure them. Right, so I'm going to cut 4 scraps of foam, make them about 1 inch square, 2.5 centimetres square. And move that over to that side so you can see. And then I'm going to use my washer just to mark where I'm cutting slits into these foam scraps. So these are going to go on the back of our magnetic snaps just to keep them extra secure, give them a little bit of extra something to hang on to. So mark the prong slits on each of these scraps. And then I'm going to use my scissors just to snip into these. Just do very, very tiny snips. Okay, so we've got our holes ready, we've got our snaps ready. We should have 4 washers. Now when we add these snaps, all that we need to make sure is that both male halves are on the one side and both female halves are on the other side. Okay, so don't put a male and a female, unless you put the other ones, the opposite ones on the other side, but we need to make sure that we don't do a male and a male, because they're not going to snap together. Okay, so I'm going to do both of my females first, and then I know that they're installed. So all you do is reach through the hole in your lining. I've just pulled my pin out and I'm not 100% certain of where those prong slits are. There they are. I wonder if I've managed to seal them up again with my fray check. That wouldn't be very good, would it? I think what I might do is from the wrong side where I can see those, just poke the end of my scissors through to make sure that those holes are still open. Yes, they are. Okay, so I'm just pushing through from the right side. Add a scrap of foam. Add a washer. And then we're going to bend the prongs. Now, I like to bend my prongs inwards because then there is no chance of them slipping out, because the only thing they are pulling against is themselves. So I would recommend you also do the same, and then I've added in a scrap of duct tape over the top. So that snap is in. Now that was a female, so I'm going to do another female on this side. I can find the holes this time. There we go. First time, see? And then add a scrap of foam, just to give it a bit of extra stability, a bit of extra something to hang on to. And the washer. And then bend those down. Add a bit of tape over the back. Just, well, this adds an extra layer of security, a bit of extra confidence that they're not going to slip out, but also stops the prongs rubbing through to the lining. Well, not really the lining, is it? It's the outside. Okay, now I'm going to go in through the zip pocket hole and add the rest, the other 2 magnetic snaps. So I've got my 2 male halves here. Find the holes that I made earlier. It's a lot easier to find these holes on plain fabric, I must say. Okay, add the snap. Make sure all those layers are nice and flat before you bend the prongs in, and then it will prevent any puckers. Bend the prongs in, and again, and a bit of tape just to secure it. So this situation is why we need 2 turning gaps, really. It just makes it a lot easier to be able to do things like this, but it also means that we're able to then close the first turning gap using the zip pocket. Right, so where are my holes for this one? There-ish. Let's see if I can get that through. I seem to have somehow sealed my holes with fray check, which full credit to the fray check for that, because that's kind of what you want it to do, I suppose, isn't it? You want it to stop holes from growing. But in this case, I really wanted those holes to be there when I came back to them. Okay, add my last washer. And then add a bit of tape. We're very nearly done. We can add our base next. There we go. Okay. That's our, oh, hang on, I've got a bit too much foam there, I think. I'm going in the seam. If you put your foam a bit far down, just trim it a bit off. You'll be able to tell because it'll be a bit bulky in the top seam there when you come to turn it through. Right, so we've still got our two turning gaps open. We need our feet and bag base. So you should have 4 feet and your bag base. Ah, right, I've added a piece of tape. So I know, I can see that my tape is that end. So I'm going to put that in that way round, and both of the pieces of tape facing up. So those holes should match perfectly in theory. Love a good theory. So what we're going to do is from the outside, going to poke these feet through the hole and through the hole in the bag base as well, and then open those prongs out. I'm going to fit them all first and then I'll add some tape just so that we know they're in the right place. So push it through from the right side, through the hole in the base, and open it out. And then the same for these two. Just make sure your base is nice and flat. If you're not sure where the holes are, then it does help to just flatten it out. Make sure that it's nice and flat where it should be before you add them in. That feels pretty good. Oh, I might have lost my hole. Hang on. Right, I've opened this one out, not in the hole I created, but in just an extra hole that I've somehow created. Very skillfully done there. I'll just move that out of the way. I appear to have done the same in it. Right, top tip, look at what you're doing if you're doing a tutorial video. Okay, aren't we glad that I'm here to give you these top tips? Right, and actually that hole in the lining is big enough to have done that from the start. So I've got no excuse really. Okay, so all of those are in the holes in theory. Just double check that the mesh is sitting nice and flat from this side, yeah. And I like to sort of tuck the end of my mesh under the seam allowances inside. So in this area where the end is meeting the main panel, just use your fingers to double check and get those seam allowances on top of the mesh, because I find that the base sits nice and neat then. Okay, right, another stray thread. I'll just get that before I go any further. Right, so our feet are added, our magnetic snaps are added. We just need to close these holes in the lining. So I'm going to change my thread over to my white thread and then we'll close those up. Right, we're very close now, so all we need to do is reach through your zip pocket. You've got a turning gap in the bottom of your zip pocket. Reach through and pull the lining out. Okay, this might seem a bit odd, but it will become clear. So pull the lining out and you'll be able to see this hole in the bottom of the lining then. So I've pulled it out through the zip pocket and I can see this turning gap. Now I can see that line of stitches where I have my basting stitches. And all I'm going to do is add a couple of pins along there. We're just going to sew this closed on the wrong side, like any other seam. Okay. Now if you found that your lining was a little bit saggy or baggy inside, then you have got the option of taking a bit extra seam allowance when you're closing this turning gap. So if you found that it was a little bit baggy, you can always start off at the regular seam allowance just to catch the start of the turning gap, and then you can always taper to slightly bigger and back again. So I've sewn that closed from inside the zip pocket. So when we turn that through, it's just going to look like any other seam. It won't be obvious that that used to be a turning gap at all. So we can push that back through the zip pocket, smooth it out in place, just make sure that, oh hang on, I forgot to add my duct tape to the back of my feet. Well remembered, gosh. Okay, so I felt those while I was smoothing that lining out, so that's why we have the tape on the back of the prongs, so that you don't feel them. So I'll reach through the hole in my zip pocket, not quite as ideal as doing it through the turning gap, because the turning gap in the main lining, because the hole is a bit smaller. But as long as you can see where you're aiming for, not too bad. Okay, so I'll add a bit of tape onto all 4 of those. Gosh, good job I felt those, otherwise I might have had frustrations every time I put my hand in my bag and felt those prongs. Okay, so they're covered, so I shouldn't feel them. Right, so just smooth your lining out. Pretend that that was all done in order. Smooth this out, make sure that that is all as it should be now. Yep, all good. And that lining fits very, very nice and neat now. Okay, so all that's left to do is close up our final turning gap. So before you do, just double check that you're happy with your magnetic snaps and there's not too much extra foam there. Might just snip a little bit extra off of the foam either side of the duct tape, just to make sure that that's nice and neat on that one. That one looks neat. And these two look neat. Lovely. Okay, so now we can pull the zip pocket out. And look, my seam allowances are already turned under from before. If you like a really, really nice neat finish, then you can use a ladder stitch by hand to close these. If you are more about the big picture than the small detail, then you can use a really close machine top stitch to close these. After all, they're going to be inside your pocket, and hopefully the only person going inside your pocket is you. So if it's going to bother you, then do it by hand. If not, then you can do it on your machine. So I'm just using my regular stitch length, but I'm just sewing really close to the edge without going off. Okay, we'll take these pins out, push it all back in, and then we can give it a final press before we use it, and it's ready for its first outing. So pop everything back where it should be, all the pockets in place, push the lining down in place. That lining fits pretty well. Now, the first few uses, you're going to find that these ends don't sit quite how you want them to. So what I like to do is just pinch these together along the centres, so match your side seams, pinch them, and then do your snap up, just for the first few uses, and then that will train that end to crease along that part. If this is going to bother you and you've got a particularly strong sewing machine, you can always pinch along the centre and just add a couple of stitches into the top there, just to keep those two layers together. I don't think it needs it, because after a little while it just gets used to it and is trained into that shape. But if it bothers you, then that's the solution there. Okay, so clip your snaps together, pop your snaps together, and I'm going to leave that to sit for a little while before my first use so that it sort of trains into the shape I want it. You can give it a nice final press if you need to, but I am pretty chuffed with that. I think that's a really nice bag and I can see me using that a lot. Thank you for sewing with me, thank you for watching, and I can't wait to see what you make. If you do make a happy handbag, one of these, then please do show us. You can tag me on social media. I'm at Sewing Patterns by Mrs H, or you can find us in our groups, Sewing Patterns by Mrs H support group, Bag of the Month Club, British Bag Makers if you're in the UK, or you can send us a message or an email, mrs.h@mrs-h.com, or you can find our other patterns on mrs-h.com. I've also got a range of skill builder tutorials and videos and exclusive patterns on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Bagoneer. I look forward to seeing what you make with this pattern, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you.